In the world of federal governance, hearings before congressional committees are often regarded as formalities, but they are, in fact, critical mechanisms for ensuring accountability. They provide elected representatives the opportunity to scrutinize executive actions, budget allocations, and the consequences of administrative decisions. One particularly instructive instance of such oversight occurred during a hearing where Representative Rosa DeLauro confronted Attorney General Pam Bondi regarding proposed budget cuts to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives ATF and the Drug Enforcement Administration DEA. The exchange, at first glance, may appear to be a simple clash over numbers, but a careful, professional analysis reveals deeper lessons about policy, accountability, and the mechanisms of congressional oversight. At the outset of the exchange, DeLauro posed a straightforward and unambiguous question. How many ATF agents and industry operations investigators do you anticipate will be lost as a result of the funding reduction you are proposing? The simplicity of this question belies its significance. In the context of federal budget proposals, numerical data is not merely technical. It is a quantitative backbone of policy implications. Every agent represents an operational capacity, a unit of enforcement potential, and a link in the chain that maintains public safety. By asking for exact figures, DeLauro was demanding transparency and precision, two critical elements in the evaluation of any federal proposal. The precise numbers are not political rhetoric. They are the real-world indicators of how public safety agencies can function under proposed funding levels. Attorney General Bondi's initial response, however, illustrates a common challenge in congressional oversight: the deflection of specific, accountability-driven questions through generalized statements. Bondi's answer focused on a narrative of operational philosophy rather than delivering numerical clarity. She emphasized the desire for ATF agents to be out on the streets and suggested that restructuring the agencies, merging ATF with DA, would enhance efficiency. While this assertion may appear compelling to a lay audience, in oversight terms it constitutes what is commonly referred to as a filibuster or talking point diversion. By replacing concrete numbers with general assurances, the witness shifts attention from the measurable consequences of policy to a politically palatable narrative. The tension in this exchange underscores an essential aspect of congressional oversight: the persistence required to extract factual information. DeLauro, recognizing the deflection, refused to accept generalized statements. She interjected multiple times, reiterating the question in precise terms, emphasizing that the request was not for abstract philosophy or ideological posturing, but for documented figures. This insistence on precision is emblematic of effective oversight. When numbers and policy intersect, the truth cannot be conveyed through slogans. It must be drawn from documentation and factual records. Eventually, DeLauro took the next step that professional oversight often demands. She referenced the administration's own documents. By consulting the Department of Justice's fiscal year 2026 budget and performance summary, she was able to quote directly, noting that ATF would eliminate 541 industry operations investigators, reduce regulatory capacity by approximately 40%, and anticipate a loss of 284 support personnel and 186 law enforcement agents due to historical attrition. This was a pivotal moment. By grounding the discussion in the administration's own reporting, DeLauro shifted the exchange from rhetoric to verifiable facts. The significance of this cannot be overstated. Budget documents, often dense and overlooked, contain the operational blueprint for federal agencies. By citing them directly, DeLauro transformed a potentially obfuscatory hearing into a substantive accountability exercise. From a policy perspective, the numbers DeLauro cited carry substantial implications. The elimination of 541 industry operations investigators represents a nearly 40% reduction in the ATF's capacity to regulate firearms and explosives industries. Regulatory oversight is a preventive function. These investigators identify illegal activity, trace firearms, and enforce compliance before violations escalate into violent crime. Reducing this capacity is not simply an administrative adjustment. It is a tangible weakening of preventive enforcement. Similarly, the loss of 186 law enforcement agents due to attrition is more than a statistic. Each agent embodies operational reach, investigative expertise, and field presence. A reduction in personnel inevitably constrains the agency's ability to respond to illegal gun trafficking, undermining both federal enforcement objectives and local law enforcement partnerships. Bondi's continued insistence that agents want to be out on the streets highlights another critical aspect of oversight: the difference between narrative framing and operational reality. The argument that agents will be redeployed does not counter the documented reduction in regulatory capacity. Preventive enforcement, such as inspections and industry monitoring, is a core function of the ATF. Removing resources from these functions does not increase enforcement efficacy. It merely shifts the operational footprint, potentially leaving gaps where illegal activity can proliferate. DeLauro's methodical presentation of numbers demonstrates how data can clarify the consequences of policy proposals in ways that narrative alone cannot. This exchange also illuminates broader lessons about bureaucratic restructuring. Merging ATF with DEA, as Bondi proposed, is framed as an efficiency measure. On paper, combining agencies with overlapping missions may reduce administrative overhead. In practice, however, such mergers carry transition costs, including retraining, reallocation of resources, and temporary disruption of field operations. DeLauro's emphasis on the actual numbers lost highlights a key oversight principle. Structural changes must be evaluated not only for their intended efficiencies, but also for their impact on operational capacity. Without adequate resources, even the most logically justified reorganization can undermine core functions, leaving gaps in enforcement and public safety. The strategic dimension of DeLauro's approach deserves attention. In oversight hearings, persistence and documentation are crucial. DeLauro did not resort to emotional appeals or sensationalized rhetoric. Instead, she systematically used public records, budgetary data, and precise questions to anchor the discussion in fact. This method effectively neutralized Bondi's rhetorical deflection. For professionals studying congressional oversight, this exchange serves as a textbook example of how discipline, preparation, and evidence-based questioning can extract accountability even from witnesses inclined to evade direct answers. Furthermore, this exchange provides a window into the interplay between policy promises and practical outcomes. Bondi had previously asserted a commitment to combating illegal gun trafficking, yet the proposed budget cuts, when analyzed in numerical terms, suggest a reduction in the very enforcement capacity needed to achieve that goal. Finally, the segment offers broader lessons about public engagement and transparency. Oversight hearings are often televised or reported, and the public rarely witnesses the interplay between precise questioning and evasive answers. DeLauro's methodical approach transforms abstract bureaucratic discussions into accessible evidence-based analysis. By repeatedly returning to documented figures, she ensures that the consequences of policy decisions are visible not only to policymakers, but to the public. In doing so, she reinforces the principle that accountability is not only a legislative obligation, but a democratic necessity. In conclusion, the initial segment of this exchange between Representative Rosa DeLauro and Attorney General Pam Bondi exemplifies the mechanics of effective congressional oversight. Through disciplined questioning, precise documentation, and an unwavering focus on verifiable numbers, DeLauro successfully navigated deflections, highlighted discrepancies between policy rhetoric and operational reality, and grounded the discussion in facts that have tangible consequences for public safety. The episode serves as a case study for policymakers, journalists, and citizens alike, illustrating how accountability is achieved not through volume or emotion, but through preparation, persistence, and the rigorous application of evidence. The numerical details: 541 industry operations investigators eliminated, 40% reduction in regulatory capacity, 186 law enforcement agents lost to attrition, are not mere statistics. They are indicators of the real-world consequences of fiscal decisions on the nation's ability to enforce law, prevent crime, and protect its citizens. The second segment of the exchange between Representative Rosa DeLauro and Attorney General Pam Bondi further illuminates the tension between fiscal policy proposals and the operational realities of law enforcement agencies tasked with protecting the public. While the first segment focused primarily on the question of accountability and the extraction of precise numbers regarding staffing losses at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives ATF, This portion of the hearing emphasizes the operational fallout of budgetary reductions, the preventive role of federal oversight, and the broader implications for public safety. DeLauro begins this segment by highlighting the decline in fentanyl seizures reported by Customs and Border Protection, CBP, noting a 30% decrease compared to the previous year. This is not a trivial detail. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid far more potent than heroin, has been a driving factor in the opioid epidemic, responsible for tens of thousands of overdose deaths annually. The decline in seizures is indicative of broader enforcement challenges, particularly at a time when federal agencies, including DEA and ATF, are facing proposed reductions in both personnel and resources. By situating the discussion within the context of measurable enforcement outcomes, DeLauro reframes the debate from abstract budgeting to the tangible effects on public health and safety. At the core of DeLauro's questioning is a juxtaposition between the Attorney General's assurances during confirmation hearings and the implications of the proposed fiscal plan. Bondi had asserted her commitment to combating illegal gun trafficking, yet the proposed 26% cut to ATF's budget threatens the agency's ability to fulfill this promise. Here, DeLauro expertly demonstrates a key principle of professional oversight, the comparison between policy commitments and documented administrative actions. Budgetary cuts are not merely reductions in financial resources. They translate directly into operational capacity, personnel availability, and the ability to execute preventive functions. Bondi's responses in this segment continue to illustrate a pattern observed in the previous portion, a preference for narrative framing over substantive numerical clarification. Her repeated insistence that agents won't be out on the streets serves as a rhetorical device aimed at reframing the discussion in terms of morale and agency culture rather than addressing the structural consequences of fiscal reductions. While agent morale is an important factor in operational efficiency, it cannot offset the functional consequences of losing hundreds of personnel and investigators. DeLauro's approach, grounded in numbers and documentation, exposes this rhetorical deflection and keeps the discussion anchored in policy reality. A critical element that emerges in this segment is the differentiation between preventive and reactive enforcement. The ATF's regulatory functions, including industry inspections and oversight of firearms and explosives dealers, serve as preventive mechanisms designed to intercept illegal activities before they escalate into criminal incidents. Bondi's emphasis on street-level enforcement, while not irrelevant, neglects this crucial dimension. The reduction of 541 industry operations investigators and projected attrition of 186 agents do not simply reallocate resources. They diminish preventive oversight. This is a fundamental policy insight. Preventive enforcement is often less visible but more impactful in mitigating crime, and its erosion has long-term consequences for both federal and local law enforcement. DeLauro's persistent questioning also underscores another essential aspect of professional oversight: the use of historical patterns and projected attrition to understand the operational trajectory of agencies under proposed budget conditions. Attrition in federal agencies is a predictable phenomenon. Retirement, voluntary departures, and transfers occur at consistent rates. By citing historical attrition patterns, DeLauro effectively illustrates that the proposed budget cuts will inevitably reduce the number of operational agents, regardless of morale or agency restructuring. This predictive analysis is a cornerstone of evidence-based oversight, demonstrating foresight and planning rather than reactive questioning. Furthermore, the discussion highlights the intersection of law enforcement capacity and public safety outcomes. Reductions in ATF personnel and regulatory capacity directly impact the agency's ability to identify illegal firearms and enforce compliance among licensed dealers. Each reduction in investigative or regulatory staff translates into fewer inspections, diminished intelligence gathering, and increased risk that firearms and explosives will be diverted into illegal markets. DeLauro's methodical presentation of these numbers, combined with her emphasis on preventive enforcement, allows policymakers and the public to understand that budget decisions have cascading consequences, not only on agency operations but on broader societal safety. At the outset of this segment, Bondi repeatedly emphasizes a message-oriented narrative. Her insistence that ATF agents want to be out on the streets and that they will not engage in regulatory functions, such as inspecting legal gun owners, represents a strategic rhetorical move. By framing enforcement as primarily a matter of agent disposition and operational philosophy, Bondi shifts the discussion from quantifiable losses and operational capacity to generalized assertions of morale and intention. While such statements may resonate with certain audiences, they are insufficient in oversight contexts where public accountability, transparency, and measurable outcomes are paramount. DeLauro's response demonstrates a fundamental principle of effective congressional oversight, the insistence on data-driven inquiry. By repeatedly asking Bondi for numerical answers regarding expected reductions in staffing and operational capacity, DeLauro establishes professional baseline. Accountability is achieved not through narrative persuasion but through evidence and documentation. This insistence is particularly important because the consequences of misallocation of resources are not abstract. They directly affect public safety. The ability of ATF to conduct regulatory inspections, enforce compliance, and partner with state and local law enforcement depends entirely on the staffing levels and resources allocated by Congress. Every agent lost, every investigator eliminated, and every reduction in support staff represents a concrete reduction in operational effectiveness. A critical moment occurs when DeLauro cites the Department of Justice's fiscal year 2026 budget documents, explicitly referencing page numbers and quoting performance summaries. She notes that 541 industry operations investigators are projected to be eliminated, regulatory capacity will be reduced by approximately 40%, and historical attrition patterns predict a loss of 186 agents and 284 support personnel. This moment is instructive because it demonstrates how professional oversight relies on precise sourcing and documentation. By grounding her argument in the administration's own materials, DeLauro removes ambiguity and ensures that the record reflects objective facts rather than rhetorical assertions. The interplay between narrative deflection and factual accountability in this segment offers a broader lesson about the ethics of public administration. In governance, ethical accountability is rooted in transparency. Officials are obligated to communicate the operational consequences of their policy proposals clearly and accurately. Deflection, selective framing, or rhetorical repetition may serve political objectives, but they undermine public trust and impede effective oversight. DeLauro's methodical insistence on documentation illustrates how ethical oversight can counteract evasive tactics, ensuring that policy consequences are visible, verifiable, and understandable to both legislators and the public. An important dimension of this segment is the examination of preventive versus reactive enforcement functions. Bondi's repeated framing emphasizes street-level operations, implying that agents will remain actively engaged in direct law enforcement. While street presence is undeniably important, it does not replace the preventive regulatory functions that constitute the ATF's core mission. Industry inspections, investigative oversight, and compliance enforcement prevent illegal firearms and explosives from entering illicit markets. The elimination of 541 investigators and the reduction of regulatory capacity by 40% are not trivial figures. They represent a systematic weakening of preventive enforcement, which can lead to long-term increases in criminal activity and firearm diversion. DeLauro's focus on this distinction reinforces the importance of understanding the operational consequences of fiscal policy, particularly in agencies where preventive enforcement is critical to public safety. Segment 3 also illuminates the strategic approach required for legislative oversight. DeLauro demonstrates 3 key tactics: preparation, persistence, and precision. Preparation entails familiarization with departmental budgets, understanding historical staffing patterns, and identifying the operational functions linked to each budget line. Persistence involves a repeated insistence on specific answers, resisting attempt at obfuscation or narrative diversion. Precision requires the accurate citation of official documents, numbers, and language, which establishes an unassailable evidentiary basis. Together, these tactics create a methodology for effective oversight that is not dependent on partisan rhetoric or public theatrics, but on measurable evidence and professional rigor. A significant ethical dimension arises in this segment when considering the framing used by Bondi regarding legal gun owners. By emphasizing that ATF agents will not visit legal gun owners at night, Bondi appeals to a politically charged narrative designed to reassure constituents and avoid criticism. While politically strategic, this framing diverts attention from the real operational impact of budget cuts on preventive enforcement and investigative capacity. DeLauro's insistence on numeric and operational clarity exposes this diversion, highlighting the ethical necessity for public officials to separate messaging from measurable administrative impact. This segment also addresses the implications of structural reforms, specifically the proposed merger of ATF with DEA. Bondi frames a merger as a logical alignment of agencies dealing with related criminal activity, guns and drugs, claiming it will enhance efficiency. However, DeLauro's questioning emphasizes that efficiency cannot compensate for losses in personnel or investigative capacity. Structural reform in the absence of adequate resources risks creating operational gaps, potentially reducing overall enforcement effectiveness. This point underscores a broader principle in public administration. The operational consequences of policy and structural decisions must be carefully analyzed, especially when they impact preventive enforcement and public safety outcomes. Furthermore, Segment 3 highlights the broader societal consequences of budgetary reductions. Each reduction in ATF personnel and regulatory capacity has cascading effects on the enforcement ecosystem. State and local law enforcement agencies, which often rely on federal support for investigations, task forces, and intelligence, are forced to operate with fewer resources and diminish federal collaboration. DeLauro effectively communicates this downstream impact, demonstrating that federal budget decisions cannot be evaluated in isolation. They reverberate to the entire law enforcement network, affecting capacity of communities to prevent and respond to violent crime. The segment also illustrates the role of public documentation and transparency in effective governance. By referencing the Department of Justice's performance summaries, DeLauro ensures that the exchange is anchored in verifiable evidence. This approach underscores a professional oversight principle. Hearings are most effective when they produce a clear public record of operational consequences. Rhetorical framing and narrative diversion, by contrast, may temporarily shift attention but cannot substitute for documented evidence, which remains accessible to legislators, policy analysts, and the public. The ongoing exchange between Representative Rosa DeLauro and Attorney General Pam Bondi provides an in-depth examination of the broader implications of the proposed budget reductions for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, and the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA. While previous segments address the extraction of specific staffing numbers, the operational fallout reduced preventive enforcement, and the ethical and procedural challenges of narrative deflection, this portion shifts attention to the cumulative consequences of these budgetary proposals and the broader national security and public safety concerns that emerge from them. DeLauro begins by emphasizing the systematic impact of the proposed reductions on ATF's capacity to conduct regulatory oversight. The elimination of 541 industry operations investigators, coupled with the attrition of 186 law enforcement agents and 284 support personnel, represents not just a temporary operational inconvenience, but a significant structural weakening of the agency. Preventive enforcement is particularly affected, as fewer investigators inevitably result in fewer inspections, reduced intelligence gathering, and diminished oversight of licensed firearms and explosives dealers. The cumulative effect of these reductions is not linear. It is exponential. Fewer inspections and less regulatory capacity increase the likelihood that illegal firearms will enter the criminal marketplace, thereby amplifying risks to communities nationwide. Bondi's repeated focus on street-level enforcement presents a narrowly defined vision of operational efficacy. While street presence is vital for direct response to criminal activity, it cannot compensate for the loss of preventive regulatory functions. DeLauro underscores this point by highlighting the interconnected nature of preventive and reactive enforcement. The ATF's regulatory inspections serve as a first line of defense against illegal firearms trafficking. When preventive capacity is diminished, the burden shifts downstream, forcing reactive enforcement units and local law enforcement agencies to respond to crimes that could have been prevented. This shift increases the operational strain on agencies, reduces investigative efficiency, and ultimately compromises public safety. The discussion also situates the budget cuts within the broader context of federal drug enforcement. DeLauro references a 4.4% reduction in DEA funding alongside a 34% cut to the high-intensity drug trafficking areas, HITA program, and the absence of dedicated funding for the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, OCDETF. The cumulative effect of these cuts extends beyond ATF operational capacity. It undermines the federal government's ability to address the increasingly complex nexus of firearms and narcotics trafficking. Criminal organizations that traffic illegal drugs often rely on firearms to maintain control over distribution networks. A reduction in ATF personnel and regulatory oversight, combined with diminished DEA resources, creates a feedback loop that allows criminal networks to operate with reduced risk of detection or interruption. A critical dimension of this segment is the national security implications of reduced enforcement capacity. Illegal firearms trafficking is not merely a matter of local crime. It intersects with broader public safety and national security concerns. Firearms diverted from licensed dealers to illicit markets are often used in violent crime, including homicides, armed robberies, and gang-related activity. Additionally, firearms trafficking networks can intersect with organized crime, transnational smuggling, and terrorist activity. By reducing the federal capacity to monitor and enforce compliance in the firearms industry, the proposed budget increases vulnerabilities within the domestic security infrastructure, potentially facilitating the proliferation of illegal weapons that can threaten communities and destabilize law enforcement efforts. DeLauro's line of questioning in this segment also highlights the importance of interagency collaboration. The proposed merger of ATF with DEA is framed by Bondi as an efficiency measure, premised on the notion that guns and drugs are linked in criminal activity. However, DeLauro emphasizes that efficiency cannot be achieved if operational capacity is simultaneously reduced. The structural benefits of merger, including improved intelligence sharing and coordinated operations, are contingent upon adequate staffing, investigative resources, and operational funding. Without these, a merged agency risks underperforming in both drug and firearms enforcement, undermining the intended policy objectives. The segment further examines the downstream consequences for state and local law enforcement. Federal agencies often serve as force multipliers for local police departments by providing specialized investigative capabilities, intelligence, and operational support. The loss of hundreds of ATF agents and investigators, coupled with cuts to DEA resources, transfers the operational burden to local agencies that may lack the capacity to fill these gaps. This has real-world implications. Local law enforcement may face increased violent crime, illegal firearms trafficking, and narcotics distribution without sufficient federal support. DeLauro's approach highlights the ethical responsibility of federal budgetary decisions to consider these cascading effects on public safety at all levels of law enforcement. A central theme in this segment is the strategic use of public records and documentation to counter narrative framing. Bondi repeatedly emphasizes operational philosophy and agent morale, attempting to reassure stakeholders that enforcement priorities remain intact. However, DeLauro's precise citation of fiscal reports, historical attrition patterns, and projected reductions demonstrates the disconnect between narrative framing and operational reality. This methodological approach exemplifies professional oversight, the use of verifiable evidence to ensure that public records accurately reflect the consequences of policy proposals. In doing so, DeLauro transforms a politically charged hearing into an evidence-driven analysis of operational and societal impact. DeLauro also draws attention to the ethical dimension of federal budgeting. Reductions in preventive enforcement and regulatory oversight do not merely represent administrative adjustments. They have tangible consequences for public safety. Each investigator lost, each agent removed from operational capacity, corresponds to a reduction in the government's ability to intercept illegal firearms, prevent violent crime, and support local law enforcement. Ethical governance requires that budgetary decisions be made with full awareness of these consequences. By systematically linking budget reductions to operational and societal outcomes, DeLauro emphasizes that oversight is not only a procedural exercise, but an ethical imperative. Moreover, this segment highlights the importance of operational metrics in evaluating policy effectiveness. The decline in fentanyl seizures reported by Customs and Border Protection, coupled with the anticipated reductions in ATF and DEA capacity, provides measurable indicators of enforcement challenges. These metrics serve as early warning signals for policymakers, illustrating the potential unintended consequences of fiscal decisions. At the beginning of this segment, Bondi repeatedly emphasizes the notion that ATF agents want to be out on the streets, and that the agency will continue to focus on frontline enforcement rather than regulatory inspections. This framing represents a deliberate attempt to present a narrative that emphasizes morale, operational commitment, and public reassurance. By focusing on what agents want or where they will be deployed, the discussion shifts from quantifiable staffing losses, preventive enforcement reductions, and measurable regulatory capacity to subjective impressions of agency function. DeLauro, recognizing this rhetorical strategy, responds by systematically returning to verifiable data. She cites the Department of Justice's fiscal year 2026 budget and performance summaries, highlighting the elimination of 541 industry operations investigators, a 40% reduction in regulatory capacity, and projected attrition of 186 agents and 284 support personnel. By anchoring the conversation in concrete figures, DeLauro exposes the limitations of narrative framing and ensures that the public record reflects measurable operational realities. This approach illustrates a fundamental principle of professional oversight. While political messaging may influence perceptions, effective scrutiny relies on documented facts, numerical analysis, and operational metrics. Political framing in federal hearings often serves multiple purposes. First, it allows witnesses to project confidence and maintain public trust. In Bondi's case, emphasizing that agents will remain on the streets reassures constituents concerned about firearm enforcement, drug trafficking, and public safety. Second, it provides a mechanism to deflect scrutiny away from politically sensitive issues, such as budget cuts and staffing reductions. By shifting the conversation from numbers to narrative, witnesses can avoid addressing uncomfortable truths directly. DeLauro's persistence highlights the ethical responsibility of oversight to counteract such framing with evidence-based inquiry. A critical consequence of political framing is its potential to distort public understanding of enforcement capacity. When officials emphasize street-level presence while neglecting reductions in preventive functions, the public may perceive enforcement effectiveness to be intact when, in reality, operational capacity is diminished. This distortion has significant policy implications. Policymakers, stakeholders, and the general public may make decisions or form opinions based on incomplete or misleading information. DeLauro's insistence on documented figures counters this distortion, ensuring that the conversation accurately reflects the tangible consequences of fiscal decisions. Segment 5 also delves into the long-term implications of the proposed budget cuts on public safety, regulatory oversight, and enforcement effectiveness. The elimination of hundreds of ATF investigators and support personnel reduces the agency's capacity to conduct inspections, gather intelligence, and prevent illegal firearms trafficking. These reductions have a cumulative effect. Fewer preventive inspections increase the likelihood that firearms will enter criminal markets, intensifying risks of violent crime. At the same time, cuts to DEA funding and specialized task forces undermine federal capacity to disrupt drug trafficking networks. The combined impact of these reductions represents a systemic weakening of law enforcement infrastructure, with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate fiscal year. Bondi's repeated reliance on narrative assurances also illuminates the broader challenge of aligning public messaging with operational reality. Federal agencies, particularly those responsible for law enforcement, are subject to intense public scrutiny and political pressures. Messaging often emphasizes morale, operational philosophy, or strategic intent, but it cannot replace the tangible consequences of resource allocation. DeLauro's approach, linking documented staffing reductions to preventive enforcement losses and public safety outcomes, demonstrates how oversight can bridge the gap between political narrative and operational truth. Another critical aspect of this segment is the ethical responsibility of federal officials to communicate both intentions and consequences clearly. By framing enforcement primarily in terms of agent morale and street presence, Bondi's testimony highlights a common ethical challenge: the tension between politically expedient messaging and transparent communication about operational capacity. Oversight, as exemplified by DeLauro, functions as a corrective mechanism, ensuring that policy proposals are evaluated in terms of measurable outcomes rather than rhetorical appeal. Segment 5 also examines the long-term implications of structural and budgetary changes. The proposed merger of ATF and DEA, while framed as an efficiency measure, cannot fully realize its intended benefits if coupled with significant budget reductions. Structural alignment may theoretically improve coordination between agencies handling related criminal activity, such as firearms and drug trafficking. However, without adequate staffing, operational resources, and preventive enforcement capacity, the merger risks creating operational gaps, reducing overall effectiveness, and undermining public safety. DeLauro's questioning emphasizes that the benefits of structural reform are contingent upon sufficient resourcing and careful operational planning.